every single doctor at the hospital had given up. The most feared mob boss on the entire East Coast, a man who built a whole criminal empire with blood and danger before he even turned 30, was just lying in a fancy private hospital room. Armed guards stood outside his door. Machines beeped slowly around him, like a countdown. 3 weeks earlier, 3 bullets had ripped through Marcus Stone's body. Right outside his own restaurant in downtown Manhattan, no brain activity, organs starting to fail. His older brother had already signed the papers, 72 hours, then they were pulling the plug. The criminal underworld was already circling like hungry wolves. His enemies were grabbing his territory piece by piece, and every single person who walked into that hospital room, every single one, came out of fear or greed. Not one person came because they actually loved him. But every night, a 27-year-old cleaning woman named Kara Flynn would push her little cart into room 1847. And she would do something nobody else did. She talked to him, not because she knew he was a billionaire crime boss. Not because she wanted anything from him. She talked to him because her grandma taught her an old Irish prayer and a simple belief that the soul can hear what the body can't. Kara was barely surviving herself. Single mom, 3 jobs, 1 tiny daughter named Lily, scars on her wrist from an abusive ex who pushed her down the stairs while she was 7 months pregnant. $1,200 in medical debt, 1 missed paycheck away from the street. She had every reason to keep her head down, mind her own business, survive, but instead she pulled up a chair next to this silent stranger's bed. And she told him about her daughter's first words, about the moon Lily pointed at every single night, about the one-eyed stuffed bunny they found at a thrift store for $2, and deep inside that endless gray fog of his coma, the most dangerous man in New York was holding onto her voice. Like a drowning man gripping a rope, because Kara's stories about little Lily were the only points of light keeping his mind from slipping away forever. Then came the night that changed absolutely everything, when Kara had no choice but to bring her sick, feverish, crying baby girl to the hospital with her. And in a moment of pure desperation, she laid little Lily on the chest of a man the whole world had already declared dead. What happened over the next 8 hours wasn't medicine, wasn't science, and no doctor on this earth could ever explain it. Dante Reeves stood in the hospital hallway, back against the cold white wall, eyes down, staring at the dried blood still on his sleeves. He hadn't changed his shirt since that night. 3 weeks ago, he could still smell the gunpowder, still hear the tires screaming across the wet street, still see the moment Marcus collapsed on the sidewalk, eyes wide open, fixed on the night sky, like he was surprised death could show up in such an ordinary way. Dante had dropped both shooters on the spot, 2 clean shots, but when he dropped to his knees beside Marcus, blood was already pooling under his back, and those gray eyes had closed. Dante had screamed for an ambulance, pressed both hands against the chest wound, and from that night on he hadn't left the hospital, not even once. Dante had known Marcus since they were both just broke kids in Red Hook, Brooklyn. He remembered the day Marcus was 14, standing in a grimy kitchen, watching his father's body being brought home with 2 bullets in his chest. A gift from an enemy named Victor Caruso, because the old Stone had refused to give up his territory. Marcus didn't cry that day, didn't cry at the funeral, didn't cry when his mom died of grief just 1 year later. Instead, he quietly turned into something the entire neighborhood was scared of. At 16, Marcus held his first gun. At 18, he controlled 3 city blocks. At 21, he ran the whole northern Manhattan network. Before he turned 30, he had built the Stone Empire into the largest underground power on the East Coast. Through sharp intelligence and merciless violence, but now that empire was cracking, day by day, news of Marcus's coma spread faster than any bullet. And Victor Caruso, the same man who had killed Marcus's father 22 years earlier, smelled blood in the water. First week, Caruso grabbed 2 southern territories. Second week, 3 longtime allies quietly switched sides. They just stopped answering Dante's calls. Third week, income from the underground dropped by more than half. And people who used to bow to the Stone name started whispering that it was over. Dante stood outside room 1847 every single day, watching visitors come and go. Crime bosses came to ask who would take power if Marcus died, eyes calculating, not mournful. Business partners came to confirm rumors, then walked out with phones pressed to their ears. Calling lawyers, calling Caruso, restaurant managers came to ask who would sign payroll. The beautiful women who used to surround Marcus at parties vanished, like they never existed. Not a single real tear, not a single sincere prayer. Nobody came because they missed Marcus. Nobody came because they loved him. Nobody came because they wanted him to live. That fancy hospital room with its view of Central Park. Fresh flowers every day, spotless sheets, most advanced machines money could buy. It felt colder than any morgue Dante had ever walked through. Because at least in a morgue someone comes to cry. In this room, the room of the most powerful man in New York, nobody cried at all. Dante stood there every night, staring through the glass in the door, and the only thing keeping him from falling apart was watching a small cleaning woman push her cart into the room each evening, pull up a chair, and talk to Marcus like he was still there. Dante didn't understand why she did it, but in 3 weeks, that woman was the only visitor to walk into room 1847 without wanting something. A Trevor Stone arrived at the hospital the next morning, perfectly tailored gray suit, hair neat, face showing absolutely nothing. He looked more like a finance guy heading to a board meeting, not a brother slowly losing his younger sibling. At 41, Trevor was the polished face of the Stone Empire. He ran the upscale restaurant chain, the real estate company. The legitimate businesses the family used to clean their underground money. He didn't carry a gun, didn't sit in smoky back rooms negotiating territory. For 10 years, he'd told Marcus more times than he could count, violence only leads to one inevitable ending. Marcus always smiled, told him to worry about the books and leave the streets alone. Now his brother was lying in that bed, and Trevor hated himself because the first thought that crossed his mind wasn't grief. It was, who's going to authorize this week's transfers? Dr. Sandra Park waited for him in a small conference room, brain scans and charts spread out on the table. She spoke briefly, plainly, the way only doctors who are used to death can speak. No signs of recovery. Organs failing faster than expected. Even if by some miracle he woke up, the brain damage would mean he'd no longer be the Marcus Trevor once knew. Trevor listened, nodded once, then signed the papers he knew he'd have to sign the moment he walked in. 72 hours, then they'd remove the ventilator. He left the conference room, walked down the hallway, nodded to Dante standing outside room 1847, then stepped into the elevator. He didn't go in to see Marcus. He couldn't. Because if he saw his brother lying there with all those tubes and beeping machines, he might not be strong enough to do what had to be done next. Trevor sat in his black car in the underground garage a long time, didn't start the engine, didn't turn on music, didn't make calls, just sat there, both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the concrete wall ahead. He thought about Marcus at 14, standing in that kitchen, looking at their father's body without crying. He thought about himself at 19, standing right next to him, not crying either, because Stone brothers weren't allowed to cry. Their dad had taught them that before he died, and now Trevor had just signed papers for his brother to die while his eyes stayed dry. And he hated himself for that more than anything he'd ever done in his life. 20 minutes later, he started the engine, drove to the family's private restaurant in the city, where 4 crime bosses were already waiting around a round table. The meeting was fast, cold, practical. Trevor laid it out. Marcus wasn't going to make it. The empire needed a new head. Transition had to happen quietly and in order before Caruso could react. 2 of the bosses nodded immediately. They'd been waiting for this meeting all week. One asked who would replace Marcus, looked at Trevor with a look that mixed calculation and hope. But Dante jumped to his feet from the corner of the room where he'd been sitting silently and said his boss wasn't dead yet. 72 hours hadn't passed, and anyone who wanted to talk about replacing Marcus Stone while he was still breathing should say it directly to Dante first. The room went quiet. Trevor looked at Dante and said loyalty was admirable, but reality was reality. Then continued the meeting like Dante didn't exist. Dante walked out, punched the hallway wall until his knuckles bled, then drove back to the hospital because he didn't know where else to go. When Dante stepped off the elevator onto the private ward floor, he saw it immediately. A large funeral wreath of white lilies standing right in front of room 1847, a small card in elegant writing, "Deepest condolences from Victor Caruso." Marcus wasn't dead, and yet Caruso had already sent funeral flowers, not by mistake, as a declaration. A slap across the face of the entire Stone family, his way of saying, in my eyes, he's already gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. Dante stared at the wreath for 3 seconds, then picked it up with one hand, walked to the end of the hallway, and threw it into a trash bin with a crash that echoed across the whole floor. White lily petals scattered across the hallway floor, like snow in the wrong season, and Dante stood there among the fallen petals, breathing hard, wondering if he was guarding a living man or standing watch at the door of a dead one. More than an hour away, in a tiny studio apartment in the Bronx, Kara Flynn was sitting on the kitchen floor, pressing the last bandage in the box onto little Lily's scraped knee, after the toddler tripped over a table leg. Last bandage, she'd have to buy more, but only if there was anything left after the electricity bill. And she already knew there wouldn't be, but that was a problem for tomorrow. Kara was 27, but her life already felt as long as someone who'd lived 60 years. Her mom, Mary Flynn, was the only person in the world who had ever told Kara she deserved to be loved. And she died of cancer when Kara was just 17, dying on the cheapest hospital bed insurance would cover. Shared room with 3 other patients. The last thing she did was hold Kara's hand and whisper an old Irish prayer her own mother had taught her, then told Kara to remember that prayer, because there would come a day when she'd need it more than anything else in the world. Her dad, Patrick Flynn, was a man Kara only remembered through the smell of cheap whiskey and the sound of a door slamming at midnight. He left when she was 9, left behind nothing but unpaid bills and a daughter who learned men leave. Always the family in Ireland, who her mom used to call every Christmas, cut contact after Mary died. Not out of cruelty, just because poverty on both sides of the ocean doesn't allow you to keep relationships that bring no practical benefit. Kara was 17, motherless, abandoned by her father, alone in the world. And when a guy named Ryan Cole appeared at the diner where she washed dishes, with a wide smile and warm hands that pulled her close, Kara believed God had finally heard her prayers. Ryan was 6 years older, a plumber, making enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment, and for the first 6 months he was the kindest man Kara had ever known. Then the next 6 months, he became a nightmare. It started with words, sharp, cutting remarks about her stupidity. The way she cooked, the way she laughed, the way she breathed. Then came the first slap. Ryan called it an accident. Cried while apologizing for 2 hours. Then came the second without an apology. Then the third, fourth, fifth, until Kara stopped counting and stopped wanting to. When Kara discovered she was pregnant, she believed the baby would change him. Because that's what all desperate women tell themselves. Ryan didn't change. He just found more reasons to be angry. The night when Kara was 7 months pregnant, she told Ryan she wanted to leave. She was scared for the baby. Ryan pushed her. It wasn't the hardest push he'd ever given her, but she was standing at the top of the stairs. And 12 wooden steps don't need much force to destroy everything. Kara fell, her body twisted in the air. And her only instinct was to curl around her swollen belly with both arms, letting her back and wrists slam into each step instead of the baby. She lay at the bottom of the stairs, too much pain to breathe, blood soaking her clothes, left wrist broken and swelling purple. Ryan stood at the top of the stairs, looked down at her, then walked out and closed the door. Kara lay there alone on the cold floor. One hand clutching her belly, the other limp and broken at her side, and she began to recite the Irish prayer her mother had taught her, repeating it again and again until a neighbor heard her moaning and called an ambulance. Lily was born 2 months early. Emergency surgery at a hospital in the Bronx, weighing less than 2 kilograms, so small she fit into a single adult hand. Kara lay on the operating table, staring at the white ceiling, asked the nurse if Ryan had come. The nurse shook her head. With that look of pity Kara knew too well, Ryan didn't come that day, didn't come the next, didn't come ever again. He vanished just like her father, leaving behind a long scar on her left wrist, and a baby girl who had to lie in an incubator for 3 weeks before she was strong enough to go home. When Kara held Lily for the first time, the baby was so small she was afraid she'd break her just by breathing. She whispered the Irish prayer to her daughter, told her they would be all right, even though she didn't know how. From then on, every morning she woke at 4 a.m., fed Lily, laid her in the crib, worked an early shift at the hospital, came home to feed her, worked an afternoon shift at the laundromat, came home to put her to sleep, then worked a night shift cleaning offices. Not because she was brave. Kara never thought of herself as brave. She simply had no choice but to stand up. Because if she lay down, Lily would have no one. And Kara would rather die than let her daughter grow up alone in this world. The way she had, while Kara rose every day for her little girl in the outside world, somewhere no one could reach, Marcus Stone was drifting. Not drifting like floating on water, not drifting in a dream, drifting in nothingness, a vast gray space with no up or down, no before or after, no pain but no feeling, no fear but no peace. There was simply nothing. Marcus didn't know how long he'd been there, didn't know who he was, didn't know if he was alive or dead, and most of the time he didn't care. Because nothingness had a power violence never had. It made everything gently meaningless, so gentle you didn't even bother to resist. Sometimes sounds pierced the fog, but most were cold and empty. A woman's voice spoke words about brain activity and stem function. Professional helplessness, the voice of someone used to watching people die. A man's voice, familiar but unplaceable, spoke of transitions. Timelines, decisions, sharp words that cut through the mist and then vanished. Another man's voice, younger, heavy with guilt and anger, said, "Boss, please wake up." Said he couldn't hold everything alone. Said he was sorry he hadn't been fast enough. And that voice made Marcus feel heavier, like someone was pulling him deeper. Then there was a fourth voice. This one was different from all the others. It carried no medical terms, no strategy, no guilt, no regret. This voice told stories. It spoke of a little girl who learned a new word today. The word was moon, and the child pointed at the sky and laughed. Marcus didn't know what moon was, but the way the voice shaped that word made him feel it had to be something beautiful. It spoke of a one-eyed stuffed rabbit the child hugged to sleep every night, of the way the girl held her mother's hand on the street, pointing at everything with one tiny finger, asking, "What is that?" again and again without stopping. Sometimes the voice spoke of sad things, exhaustion, fear, long sleepless nights, but even in sadness, the voice carried something Marcus couldn't find in any other sound. Warmth, real warmth, not the warmth of flattery or forced loyalty, but the warmth of someone speaking to him for no reason other than believing he deserved to hear a kind voice. Marcus didn't know who she was, didn't know what she looked like, didn't know what she was to him, but whenever that voice appeared, the gray fog got a little thinner, and whenever it faded, the darkness got heavier, and Marcus drifted farther away. That voice was the only thread he still held, and he gripped it with the deepest instinct he had left. The instinct even a coma couldn't erase, the instinct of someone about to drown, who knows that if they let go, there won't ever be a second chance. That evening, Kara came to the hospital for her shift, pushing her cleaning cart down the hallway of the private ward. Same as every night, but before she could turn toward room 1847, Nurse Patricia stepped out and stopped her. Patricia was a middle-aged woman with silver hair, always carried peppermint candy in her pocket, sometimes quietly slipped Kara a carton of milk from the staff cafeteria without saying a word. The kind of quiet kindness that comes from working in a hospital long enough to understand sometimes a free carton of milk matters more than any comfort speech. But tonight Patricia carried no candy, no milk. She carried bad news. She drew Kara aside into a corner of the hallway and told her as gently as she could that the family had decided. In 72 hours, they were removing the breathing tube from the patient in room 1847, and Patricia thought Kara should know, because she'd watched her talk to that patient every single night for 3 weeks. Kara stood there, hands still on the handle of her cart, and she cried, not sobbing, not making any sound, just tears running down both cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. And she didn't even fully understand why she was crying. She didn't know his real name until the second week when she read it on his chart. Didn't know what he did, where he lived, whether he had any real family or real friends. She only knew that for 3 weeks she had told this man everything she'd never told anyone else. About Lily, about fear, about long nights, about the small, fragile hope she kept hidden in her chest, like if she spoke it out loud it would disappear. And now the only person in the world who knew all of that was about to be gone. Kara wiped her eyes with her sleeve and asked Patricia if she could go in one last time, just for a few minutes. Patricia nodded, turned away so Kara wouldn't feel ashamed of her tears. Kara stepped into room 1847, left her cart in the hallway, and for the first time she didn't clean, didn't wipe surfaces, didn't change the trash bag. She just pulled the white plastic chair close to the bed and sat down. The room was the same as every night, steady beeping, soft lighting, the smell of disinfectant mixed with clean laundry. The 2 guards outside the door paid her no mind. They were used to the small cleaning woman who came in every night. Quietly, peacefully, Kara studied Marcus's face, really studied it, for the first time since she'd started cleaning this room. He was 36, but he had the lines around his eyes of a man in his 50s, a faint scar on his left cheek, about 2 finger lengths long, probably from a knife, a smaller, rounder scar on his neck that she didn't want to guess the origin of. But beneath those scars, beneath the harsh lines of his jaw and brow, Kara saw a tired face, tired down to the bone. The kind of exhaustion that didn't come from 3 weeks in a coma, but from a lifetime without rest. The kind of exhaustion she saw every morning in her own mirror. And she thought maybe before lying in this hospital bed, this man had never truly lived either. Maybe he'd only been surviving day by day, just like her. Only he survived in a penthouse, and she survived in a Bronx studio apartment. But loneliness doesn't care about zip codes. Kara leaned closer and started speaking, a whisper meant only for herself to hear. She said she was sorry, sorry that no one could save him, sorry that this world treated people like they only mattered while they were still useful. She told him about the invisible thread, the thing her grandmother taught her mother, and her mother taught her, that every soul in the world is connected by threads the eye can't see, and when one person gently pulls on a thread somewhere else, another person will feel it. She said she'd been pulling this thread for 3 weeks, and she didn't know if he could feel it, but she hoped he could. Then Kara placed her hand on Marcus's forehead, closed her eyes, and whispered the old Irish prayer passed down through generations from grandmother to mother. Mother to daughter, ancient words flowing softly through the quiet room, like they belonged there, like they had been waiting through generations for exactly this moment to be spoken. She held Marcus's hand one last time, her rough, cracked hand wrapping around his larger, warmer one. Held it for a long time, then let go, stood up, pushed the chair back where it belonged, and walked out of the room without looking back. Because she knew if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. Kara opened the door to the studio apartment just before midnight, flipped on the fluorescent light. It flickered 3 times before finally staying on. Pale white glare that made everything in the room look worse than it really was. Even though reality was bad enough already, she set her keys on the little table by the door, kicked off her worn sneakers, stepped into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Inside, half a carton of milk close to expiring, a piece of cheese wrapped in foil, 3 eggs, a pitcher of filtered water. She closed the fridge gently, like shutting it harder might make the few things inside vanish. By the bed, little Lily was sitting on the floor, surrounded by pillows and blankets, clutching the one-eyed stuffed bunny in her arms. Big round eyes watching her mom, a walk-in. Their neighbor, Mrs. Kim, had gone back to her own place down the hall around 9. After feeding Lily dinner, white rice and fried egg, and since then, Lily had waited alone in the locked apartment, without crying because she was used to it, not yet 2 years old, and already used to waiting, used to her mom always leaving, and always coming back, and knowing her mama would come back was enough. Kara sat down on the floor next to her, and Lily tilted her head and looked at her with eyes too old for her age, and asked Mama sad in a tiny clear voice. Kara tried to smile and said no, Mama was just tired, but her eyes were still red from leaving room 1847. And she wasn't fooling anyone, not even a child not yet 2. Her phone vibrated. Kara pulled it out and felt the blood in her veins turn cold. Ryan Cole, 2 years without a single sign, 2 years of slowly starting to believe he was truly gone. And now his name glowed on the cracked screen of her phone, like a ghost from a nightmare she thought she'd woken up from. The message was short, cold, calculated down to every word. He said he'd talked to a lawyer. He was going to file for custody because he'd heard she left the child alone at night to go to work. That was grounds for the court to reconsider. And if she wanted to resolve this quietly, she should call him back. Kara knew Ryan had a domestic violence record, knew that almost no court in New York would give him custody, knew this was nothing more than cheap extortion from a coward. But she also knew something else, something Ryan knew better than anyone. To respond to a lawsuit, she needed a lawyer. Family lawyers in New York charge $300 to $500 an hour. Even if she won, legal fees would still land somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000. Money she didn't have, had never had, and had no idea when she ever would. Ryan didn't want Lily. Ryan had never wanted Lily. He wanted money or power, or to see Kara afraid, or all three at once, and the worst part, it was working. Kara sat on the floor staring at the message until the letters blurred with tears, then deleted it with trembling fingers, as if erasing it would make it not real. Set the phone face down on the floor and pulled Lily into her arms and held her tight. The baby didn't understand what was happening, but the instincts of a child raised in instability made Lily go quiet and hug her mama back with both little arms. One hand still gripping the ear of the one-eyed bunny, Kara cried without making any sound, the kind of crying she'd mastered after years of practice. Shoulders shaking, breath breaking, but not a single noise escaping, because she didn't want Lily to hear. And as she sat there on the cold studio floor with her daughter in her arms, she thought of the $1,400 in hospital debt. From 2 months earlier, when Lily was admitted with pneumonia, 3 nights in the pediatric emergency unit, Roman 4 fluids, antibiotics, chest x-rays, and when the bill arrived, Kara had nearly fainted because Medicaid had denied a large portion. Due to a paperwork error, a single box she'd forgotten to check on the renewal form, a small, stupid mistake she hadn't had time to catch because that day she'd been running between 3 jobs. Feeding Lily on a bus, and now that mistake had become $1,400 in debt, with a collections agency calling every week. Same polite, robotic voice. Kara held Lily tighter and closed her eyes, and she felt the edge right beneath her feet. Not a metaphorical edge, a real one, the kind where one more push would send her falling, and there would be no one to catch her. Lily started coughing at 2 in the morning, a dry, raspy sound like stones grinding inside her tiny chest. By 3 a.m., her little body was burning so hot that Kara pressed a hand to her forehead and flinched away. Kara didn't have a thermometer. The old one had run out of batteries the month before. She hadn't been able to buy a new one. But she didn't need a thermometer to know this fever was worse than the others. Lily lay on the bed with her eyes squeezed shut. Cheeks flushed, sweat soaking her thin hair, letting out soft moans before another coughing fit curled her small body inward. Kara ran to the kitchen, soaked a cloth in cold water, ran back, laid it on Lily's forehead, flipped it, soaked it again, laid it back down, repeating this from 3 to 4 in the morning in the silent apartment, broken only by her child's coughing and the drip of water from the wet cloth. She gave Lily the last of the children's fever medicine, tipping the bottle carefully to catch every drop, then sat against the wall, holding her, waiting for it to work. By 4 a.m., the fever eased a little, but the coughing didn't stop. And Kara sat there watching the sky start to lighten through the dirty window, while her mind spun through calculations with no answers. It was Sunday. Mrs. Kim had said the day before she was going to visit her daughter in Queens. Wouldn't be back until late evening. No, Mrs. Kim meant no one to watch Lily. Kara had no close friends in the building, no family in the city. No one in the world except the kind neighbor who had gone to Queens. The free clinic where she usually took Lily when she got sick closed on Sundays. Wouldn't reopen until Monday. Taking her to the emergency room meant another bill she couldn't afford piled on top of the 400 already crushing her. Kara's phone buzzed at 4:15 a.m. The hospital shift supervisor, voice tired and pleading, saying the flu had knocked out 3 more members of the night cleaning crew. They were desperately short-staffed. Could Kara take the Sunday shift, 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning? Kara said she couldn't. Her child was sick. The supervisor was silent for a second, then said the 2 words she knew Kara couldn't refuse. Double pay. Kara closed her eyes. Double pay for a 12-hour shift meant enough to cover this month's rent. The landlord had already reminded her twice. It meant enough to buy fever medicine and antibiotics if Lily needed them. It meant keeping a roof over their heads for another 30 days before the next crisis. Kara opened her eyes, looked at Lily sleeping on the bed, cheeks still red, one hand gripping the ear of the one-eyed bunny, breathing heavy but a little steadier now that the medicine had kicked in. She told the supervisor she'd come in, then sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, watching her daughter sleep, hating herself for the decision, but knowing it wasn't really a decision at all. It was surrender, the kind of arithmetic poor people are forced to solve every single day. Equations where every answer is wrong, and you can only choose the one that's the least wrong. At 5 in the evening, Kara bathed Lily in warm water, dressed her in the cleanest pajamas she had, gave her a little cough syrup she found in the back of the cabinet. 2 months past expiration, but better than nothing. She wrapped Lily in the thickest blanket they owned, tucked the one-eyed bunny into her hand, pulled a little knit hat down over her head, and lifted her onto her shoulder. Lily didn't cry. She just rested her head against her mother's neck and breathed hot through her shirt. And Kara left the studio apartment, locked the door, walked down 5 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken since the week before, stepped out onto the street, caught a bus in the February cold cutting into their faces, and headed toward the hospital with her sick child in her arms, and nothing else in her coat pocket but her apartment key and her employee badge. Kara arrived at the hospital at 6 p.m., carrying Lily in her arms, entered through the employee door at the back of the building to avoid being seen. First thing she did was go to the staff break room in the basement, a small room with 2 green vinyl benches, an old wooden table, a microwave, and a pot of coffee someone brewed on the last shift and forgot to throw out. She spread her blanket over the bench against the wall, gently laid Lily down, propped her head on a folded jacket as a pillow, tucked the one-eyed bunny into her arms, stepped back and looked at her. Lily lay there curled up on the bench, so small that more than half of it was still empty, cheeks still flushed, breathing heavy, but she'd fallen asleep on the bus and hadn't woken up. Kara took a deep breath and went upstairs to clock in, and from that moment the battle between the mother and the janitor began. She cleaned rooms on the 3rd floor. Every 15 minutes she set the mop aside and ran down to the basement to check on Lily, then ran back up to keep cleaning. She cleaned rooms on the 5th floor, 15 minutes down, 15 minutes up. legs aching from the stairs, but she didn't dare take the elevator for fear of running into a supervisor and having to explain why she was breathless and sweating in the middle of winter. Every time she opened the break room door, she held her breath until she saw Lily still lying there, still breathing, still clutching the bunny, and every time she had to fight the urge to just scoop her up and run home. By 9 p.m., Lily woke up and started to fuss. The fever spiked again, her little face burning hot, eyes glassy and unfocused. She started calling Mama in a fragile voice, repeating it like a prayer where the only word she knew was her mother's name. Kara rushed down, gathered her up, wiped her face and hands and feet with a damp cloth, gave her warm water from a bottle, sat there rocking her until Lily drifted back to sleep, then laid her down again and ran back upstairs to keep cleaning. Another janitor passed the break room and saw Lily, but said nothing, only looked at Kara with the knowing eyes of someone from the same kind of life, and kept walking because everyone on the night cleaning crew carried a similar story. Everyone had a child at home or a sick relative they had to set aside to come to work. And nobody had the heart to judge. At 11 p.m., Kara looked at the room assignment list and saw room 1847. She stood staring at that number for a long time, remembering that tomorrow night, when the 72 hours were up, that room would be empty. Sheets changed, machines removed, and the man she'd talked to for 3 weeks would no longer be there. This was the last time she would clean that room while he was still breathing. She looked down the stairwell toward the basement, thought of Lily lying alone down there with a fever and her stuffed bunny, and decided she couldn't leave her alone any longer. Not one more minute. Losing her job didn't matter. Getting fired didn't matter. She was not going to leave her daughter lying alone in a cold hospital basement break room while she mopped floors. Kara ran downstairs, lifted Lily up, the child burning hot and limp against her shoulder, then carried her up to the private ward, pushing the janitor's cart with one hand, holding her child with the other. When she reached room 1847, the 2 night guards looked at her, then at the child on her shoulder. She'd cleaned this room every night for 3 weeks. They knew her face, knew she was harmless. And the older guard glanced at the sleeping child and shifted aside just enough to let her pass without a word. Kara stepped into room 1847 for the last time. The room was exactly the same as every night. Steady beeping of the machines counting down the time Marcus Stone had left. Soft amber light, stillness so deep she could hear Lily's heavy breathing against her shoulder, blending with the monitor's rhythm like 2 mismatched songs accidentally playing the same melody. Kara began cleaning the room with one hand, the other holding Lily against her hip. She was used to doing everything one-handed since Lily was born. Wiping tables with one hand wasn't the problem. Lily was the problem. The fever made the child restless and uncomfortable. She refused to stay still anywhere. Kara tried setting Lily on the plastic chair. She cried the moment her back touched the cold surface. Tried the visitor's sofa. She screamed, tried patting down a blanket on the floor, more screaming. That dry, rasping cry of a feverish child tearing through the quiet room, sending panic straight through Kara. Because she knew if the guards heard it, she'd be in trouble. And if a supervisor found out she'd brought a sick toddler into a patient's room, she'd be fired on the spot. Kara stood in the middle of the room with Lily crying in her arms, sweat running down her temples, scanning desperately for anywhere at all, warm enough and soft enough for Lily to settle. And her eyes landed on Marcus. He lay there on the hospital bed, chest rising and falling steadily with the ventilator. his large body warm beneath the white sheets, and Kara knew this was the most reckless thought she'd ever had in her life. But she had no other choice. She whispered an apology and gently placed Lily on Marcus's chest, just to rest her arms for 1 minute. Just 1 minute while she wiped the table. She'd pick her right back up. Lily touched Marcus's chest and stopped crying. Not slowly calming, stopping instantly like a switch had been flipped, the cry cut off mid-sound. Replaced by silence, the child lay there for a second, then another, then slowly curled inward like a kitten finding warmth, pressing her fever-hot cheek against Marcus's chest. Right above his heart, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of his hospital gown, and for the first time all day, Lily slept. Truly slept, her breathing slowing, evening out, her little face easing out of pain, as if the chest of this comatose man was the safest place she'd ever known. Kara stood frozen, afraid to breathe. She waited 10 seconds, 20 seconds, then bent to lift Lily, and the moment her hand touched the child, Lily screamed again. Instantly, reflexively, and Kara hurriedly placed her back on Marcus's chest, and the child fell silent. Curled up, gripping the gown, sleeping on, Kara tried a 3rd time, lifted her, cried, set her down. Silence, a 4th time, lifted her, cried, set her down. Silence, she didn't dare try a 5th. Kara pulled a chair beside the bed. Eyes, never leaving Lily sleeping on Marcus's chest. Guarding the scene like a miracle she didn't understand and didn't dare believe. When she was sure Lily was deeply asleep and safe, she began to tell stories the way she did every night. Her voice a whisper just loud enough to hear herself, telling them to both of them, to the child sleeping on the chest, and to the man sinking in darkness below. She said today had been the worst day in a long line of bad days. Spoke of Lily's fever, of the night bus in the cold, of the helplessness of not being able to protect her child from something as simple as illness and poverty. Then she spoke of the moon Lily pointed to every night on the walk home, of how the child said moon clearly and proudly, like it was the most important word in the world. And she said maybe for Lily it truly was, because the moon was always there, every night it was there. It never left. 1 hour passed, then 2, and Kara stayed there telling stories, and she didn't notice right away, but something in the room was changing. The beeping of the heart monitor started to shift, no longer the flat, steady rhythm of every other night, but a little faster, just a little, then slowing, then quickening again, as if the heart was trying to remember how to beat on its own, rather than on the machine's command. Kara looked up at the monitor. At first she thought her eyes were blurring from exhaustion, but no. The heart rate line was rippling differently, and the blood pressure numbers were creeping upward. Deep within the endless gray fog, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in 3 weeks. Something rested on his chest, light, barely there, yet warm, truly warm, not the vague warmth of memory or hallucination, but warmth with weight, with rhythm, with breath. A tiny heartbeat fluttered against him, twice as fast as his own. Quick and fragile like a butterfly's wings inside his chest, and Marcus sensed it through every layer of coma and nothingness. Then came the smell, warm milk and baby powder and child sweat, a scent he'd never known because he'd never been close to a child long enough to learn what they smelled like. Yet the deepest instinct in him recognized it instantly. Then came the hand, a tiny hand, gripping his gown with the weak yet determined grip of a sleeping child. And that grip pulled Marcus toward the light, more powerfully than any medicine or medical technology ever invented. For the first time in 3 weeks, Marcus didn't just hear, he felt, didn't just drift, he clung, didn't just exist in nothingness. He wanted to leave it. The familiar voice was still there, speaking of the moon, drawing him closer. But it was the warmth on his chest that forced him to choose between letting go and holding on. At 4 in the morning, the index finger on Marcus Stone's right hand twitched, a small movement, too slight to notice unless someone was watching closely. But Kara was holding his hand, and she felt it. She stopped breathing, heart racing, eyes locked on his hand. Waiting, the finger moved again, then the whole hand gently closed around her finger. Kara pressed the call button with her free hand, the other refusing to let go, and then Marcus opened his eyes. Marcus Stone's eyes opened for the first time in 3 weeks. The world he saw wasn't a white ceiling or harsh hospital lights. It was a blurred, shapeless chaos, like looking through murky water. Everything bleeding together into meaningless streaks of light and shadow. He didn't know where he was, didn't know who he was, didn't know how much time had passed, and his body felt heavy as lead. Every finger movement demanding an effort he wasn't sure he had. But he felt 2 things more clearly than any image before his eyes: the warmth on his chest and the voice beside him. His vision slowly focused, and the first thing Marcus saw clearly was a thin crown of light brown hair just beneath his chin, a tiny head resting on his chest, a small hand no bigger than half his palm, gripping the edge of his hospital gown. A child, the child from the stories that voice told him every night. Marcus didn't know her name, didn't know what she looked like until this moment. But he knew this was the child who loved the moon, the child who slept hugging a one-eyed stuffed bunny, the child that voice loved more than anything in the world, and somehow that child was lying on his chest. And her light breathing was the thread that had pulled him back from nothingness. Marcus shifted his eyes to the side and saw her, the woman sitting on the white plastic chair beside his bed, thin, auburn hair hastily tied back, green eyes swollen and red, tears streaming down her cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away, staring at him in disbelief. The owner of the voice, Marcus tried to speak, but his throat was dry and stiff after 3 weeks of not being used, and his lips only moved without sound. Kara hit the nurse call button again, this time over and over. And in less than a minute, the quiet room turned into a storm. The on-duty nurse rushed in, saw Marcus's open eyes, froze for a second in disbelief, then spun around and ran into the hallway, shouting for the attending doctor. Another nurse rushed in, then 2, then 3. Lights flared bright. Someone rolled in a cart of equipment. Someone checked the monitors. Someone called doctor. Sandra Park at home at 4 in the morning with a trembling voice saying, "Doctor, the patient in room 1847 is awake." Yes, truly awake, eyes open and responding. In the chaos, one nurse noticed Lily lying on Marcus's chest and stepped forward to lift the child away, because this was a serious violation, an unidentified child on an intensive care patient's bed. And as her hand slid under Lily, Marcus's hand rose, slow, shaking, weak to the point of barely having strength. But deliberate and clear, his hand settled on Lily's back, shielding her, holding her there, and his cloudy gray eyes fixed on the nurse with a look that even from a hospital bed after 3 weeks in a coma made her stop and step back. It was Marcus Stone's first conscious movement in 3 weeks, and he used it not to touch his own face, not to reach for a call button, not to do anything for himself, but to keep a child he had never met lying safely on his chest. Lily didn't wake up. She slept through the chaos, through the running footsteps and urgent voices and blazing lights. Still curled on Marcus's chest, her hand clutching his gown, and his hand, 4 times the size of hers, rested on her back. Like a promise he wasn't yet awake enough to understand he was making, the two guards outside heard the commotion and burst in with guns drawn, saw their boss's eyes open, and the older one immediately stepped back into the hallway and pulled out his phone. Called Dante Reeves. Dante was sitting in his car in the hospital parking garage, where he'd slept every single night for 3 weeks, because he didn't want to be more than 5 minutes away from his boss. And when the phone rang at 4:12 in the morning, he answered on the first ring, because Dante Reeves never let a phone ring a second time. He heard 3 words, and the phone slipped from his hand. Dante sat there staring into the darkness, his entire body shaking uncontrollably, the kind of shaking that comes when someone has held everything in for weeks and the body finally gives out and releases it all at once. He picked up the phone, dialed Trevor, fingers shaking so badly he had to try 3 times. And when Trevor answered with the irritated half-ass leap voice of a man woken at 4 in the morning, Dante managed only one sentence. "He's awake." There was silence on the line, a long silence, long enough that Dante thought the call had dropped. Then Trevor spoke in a voice Dante had never heard from him before, a voice breaking at the edges of each word, like water spilling through a cracked dam. "I'm coming now." Before dawn fully broke, news that Marcus Stone had woken from his coma spread through the New York underworld, faster than any bullet he'd ever fired. From bars in Midtown to nightclubs in the meatpacking district, from warehouses in Red Hook to penthouses uptown. Phones rang, messages flew, and reactions split cleanly in 2. Those who'd stayed loyal breathed in relief. Those who'd switched sides started sweating cold. At his mansion across the river, Victor Caruso was sitting in his wood-paneled study, drinking red wine at 5 in the morning, when one of his men knocked and entered with a pale face and said, "Valent is awake." Caruso said nothing for 3 seconds, then he tightened his grip on the wine glass and squeezed until it shattered. Red wine and blood mixing among the shards on the desk, he looked down at his bleeding hand without changing his expression, because Victor Caruso had just understood the man he declared dead with a wreath of white lilies wasn't dead at all. He would come back, and when Marcus Stone came back, the first thing he would remember would be that wreath. In the days that followed, Marcus Stone recovered in a way doctor. Sandra Park called something I have never seen in any medical textbook I've ever read. Brain function returned almost completely. Cognitive abilities came back piece by piece, memory intact, language intact, motor function weak but improving every day. She couldn't explain it with any scientific theory beyond a shrug. And the admission that sometimes the human body does things medicine hasn't caught up with yet, the physical recovery was brutal. 3 weeks of lying still had wasted his muscles. Every attempt to sit up felt like being shot all over again. But he endured it without complaint, because Marcus Stone had been stabbed, beaten, starved, and hurt enough times in real life to know that pain is just a signal from the body. And signals can be ignored. What he couldn't ignore was the memory of that night, blurred but certain. The warmth on his chest, the tiny heartbeat, the smell of milk, and the face of the woman crying beside his bed when he opened his eyes. On the 3rd day after waking, when Marcus was strong enough to sit propped against pillows and speak without losing his breath, he called Dante into the room and asked in a rough but steady voice who was the woman from that night, not a question, a demand for an answer. Dante had been waiting for it. He handed Marcus a thin file, the result of an investigation he'd ordered the very morning Marcus woke, because Dante knew his boss. and knew the first question out of Marcus's mouth wouldn't be about the Empire, wouldn't be about Caruso, wouldn't be about territory or money, but about her, Cara Flynn, 27 years old, born in the Bronx, Irish American. Single mother, one daughter named Lily, almost 2 years old, hospital janitor, evening and night shifts. Also works at a laundromat and cleans offices in Midtown. Lives in a 5th-floor studio apartment in the Bronx. No criminal record, no connections to any criminal organizations, no gambling debt, no drug involvement. Completely clean, so clean that Dante had the check run twice, because in their world nobody that clean just happened to appear beside a boss's hospital bed. But she really was clean, it really was coincidence, really was just a janitor pushing a cart into the room every night and talking to a comatose man out of pure kindness. Dante told Marcus, unable to hide his own disbelief, she had no motive at all. She didn't even know who he was. Marcus finished the file, folded it, set it on his stomach, and said, "Bring her here." 2 hours later, Cara Flynn stood at the door of room 1008, 147, in her light blue janitor uniform, hair in a ponytail. Eyes down, hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach because she didn't know what to do with them. A man in a suit had led her here, told her the patient in room 1008, 147 wanted to see her, and Cara had followed because she didn't think she had the right to refuse. Now she stood at the doorway looking into the room, seeing Marcus Stone awake for the first time. He was visibly thinner after 3 weeks, cheekbones sharper, eye sockets deeper, but those gray eyes were alive. Alive in a way that made Cara swallow and want to take a step back. They weren't the eyes of a fragile patient who had narrowly escaped death. They were the cold, sharp eyes of a man who had seen enough of this world to be surprised by nothing. And they were fixed on her without blinking, like he was reading every page of her life. Cara stepped inside. The door closed behind her. The room was silent except for the monitor. Marcus studied her for a long time. Cara met his gaze, and neither of them spoke for so long. The air grew heavy. Then Marcus spoke, voice still rough and slow, but every word clear. "You talked to me every night. Why, not a question, a demand for an explanation." The voice of a man used to giving orders rather than asking. Cara looked at him and answered more softly than she meant to, because her throat tightened. "Because no one else did. Every night I came in here to clean, and you were lying there alone. No one talked to you. No one held your hand, and my grandmother taught me that the soul can hear what the body can't. So I talked to you because I thought maybe you needed to hear a voice that wasn't asking anything from you." Marcus didn't react right away. He kept looking at her, then said the thing Cara was not prepared to hear. "I heard you, all of it. I heard about your daughter learning the word moon. I heard about the one-eyed stuffed bunny. I heard you talk about the worst night and the cold bus ride. I heard the prayer you whispered on my forehead. I heard everything, and your voice was the only thing that kept me from drifting away." Cara stood there as tears spilled down her face before she could stop them. Fast and heavy, like a valve had been opened that she couldn't find a way to close. And she cried, not from sadness, but because for the first time in her life, someone told her her voice had value. That the small kindness she gave every night while the world wasn't looking had truly reached someone. That she wasn't invisible. Marcus watched her cry and said nothing more, offered no comfort, no thanks. Because he didn't know how to do those things, but he didn't look away either. And for a man who had spent his entire life turning away from every emotion, the act of continuing to look at a woman crying in front of him without retreating was more than anyone had ever. received from him. Outside the room, Dante leaned against the wall, right hand resting on the gun at his back out of habit. Eyes watching through the small window in the door, he saw his boss, the man he'd followed since childhood, the man he'd seen do terrible things without changing his breathing, looking at a janitor woman crying with eyes Dante had never seen on him before. Not calculating eyes, not cold eyes, not pitying or indifferent eyes, soft eyes. Dante had walked beside Marcus Stone for 20 years, and he had never, not once, seen those gray eyes go soft. And now they had softened, for a thin woman in a janitor's uniform, standing and crying in a hospital room, and Dante understood something had happened during those 3 weeks in a coma that no one in their world could understand. Something bigger than Marcus simply waking up. After Kara left that day, Marcus lay in silence for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Then he called Dante in and said in a voice that left no room for questions, he wanted to know everything about her. Not a summary like the last one, everything. Dante didn't ask why. He never asked why. He only nodded and left. And 2 days later, he returned with a file 3 times thicker than before. Marcus read every page from his hospital bed. And with each page he turned, his jaw tightened a little more. The first page, Ryan Cole, 33 years old. A history of domestic violence. A restraining order that had expired, currently living in the city. Addicted to alcohol and gambling. The second page, the police report from the night Kara fell down the stairs. Photographs of her injuries, a broken wrist, extensive bruising, emergency admission to the hospital. An urgent surgery, a baby born 2 months early. The third page, threatening messages about filing for custody. Cold, calculated language, a man who didn't want a child, but wanted to use a child as leverage for money. The fourth page, the $1,200 in hospital debt from Lily's pneumonia, Medicaid denying part of the coverage due to a paperwork error. A collections agency that had sent 3 notices and called every week. The fifth page, the combined wages from 3 jobs still weren't enough. Rent, food, medicine, debt, all at once. She was 2 months behind on rent. Marcus finished the last page, folded the file, set it on the table beside his bed, and sat in silence for a long time, while Dante waited in the corner. Dante had seen his boss angry many times over 20 years. Angry when territory was violated, angry when betrayed, angry when plans failed, but those angers were cold, controlled, tools used to reach an outcome. The anger on Marcus's face now was different. It wasn't cold, it was hot, hot in a raw, primitive way Dante had only seen once before when Marcus was 14. Standing over his father's body, it was the anger of a man who wanted to protect someone and couldn't accept that she'd been hurt while he wasn't there. Marcus gave Dante 3 instructions, in order, his voice calm, but every word carrying the weight of a final decision. First, call the family's lawyers, pay off all of Kara Flynn's medical debt, anonymously, without letting her know where the money came from. Route it through a charity or medical assistance program so it looks legitimate. Dante nodded. Second, find Ryan Cole and talk to him. Not kill him, because Marcus understood a dead body creates investigations, and investigations create questions. Just talk, clearly enough that Ryan would understand if he contacted Kara or Lily one more time. Even by a single message, he'd wish he was never born. Dante nodded again, and this time he almost smiled, because this was the kind of work he did best. Third, if anyone or anything threatened Kara Flynn or her daughter from this moment forward, Dante was to handle it the same way he'd handle a direct threat to Marcus himself. Dante looked at his boss for 3 seconds and said he understood. 3 days later, Kara opened her mailbox in the apartment lobby and found an envelope from the collections agency. She was used to these envelopes, so used to them that her hands no longer shook when she opened them. Only that familiar dull ache she'd learned to live with. But inside this one wasn't a payment demand. It was a notice stating that the entire $12,400 balance had been paid in full through a community medical assistance program. Her account was closed, 0 balance. Kara read the letter twice, 3 times, then flipped it over as if the explanation had to be on the back. But there was nothing else. She didn't know which program it was, didn't remember applying for any assistance. But she didn't question it too deeply, because when you're poor to the point of desperation, you accept miracles first and ask questions later. That same week in his apartment, Ryan Cole was drinking beer when there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Dante standing there. Not alone, with 2 other men. Dante didn't say much, because he never did. He handed Ryan a phone on speaker, and Marcus Stone's voice came through the line. Slow, clear, saying exactly once what would happen if Ryan ever touched Kara's or Lily's life again. Nobody knows exactly what Marcus said, because Dante never repeated it, but the outcome was clear. Ryan withdrew his custody petition the next day, deleted Kara's number, erased every means of contact, and left town within a week without telling anyone where he was going. Kara never received another message from Ryan. She didn't understand why, but she didn't complain. She just let out a breath she'd been holding for 2 years, and held Lily a little tighter that night. But the wall hadn't fully fallen. 1 week after Marcus woke, Kara was called to the hospital administration office. 2 managers sat behind a desk with serious faces, a file in front of them. They said security cameras had recorded Kara bringing a small child into an intensive care patient's room, that it was a serious violation of safety and sanitation policy, and they had no choice but to let her go. Kara sat there listening, and she didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't explain, because she was too tired to beg anyone for anything anymore. She only nodded and prepared to stand and leave when the phone on the desk rang. 1 manager answered, listened for 30 seconds, his face draining from serious to pale, then set the phone down and looked at his colleague with the look of someone who just realized he was standing in a minefield. The call was from the hospital's legal department, and the message was simple. The Stone family had donated more than $2 million to this hospital over the past 3 years, and the family's legal representative had just called to say if an employee named Kara Flynn was affected in any way related to her job, the family would reconsider all future funding commitments. The 2 managers looked at each other, then at Kara, and the older one spoke in a completely different voice than a minute before, saying perhaps they'd been a bit hasty, they'd review her case, and Kara could return to work as usual. Kara left the office without understanding what had just happened, without knowing why the storm had suddenly stopped, without knowing that a hand was moving in the shadows behind her life, quietly and carefully removing every threat. The hand of the man she'd spoken to every night when he couldn't answer, who was now answering in the only way he knew how. Marcus Stone was discharged from the hospital on a Tuesday morning, stepping into the black SUV waiting at the entrance. Dante opening the door, 2 escort vehicles front and back, and the underworld understood the wolf had returned. In the first week, Marcus met with each crime boss one by one at his penthouse, not as a group, individually. Because Marcus knew fear worked best when it was personal. Those who had stayed loyal throughout the 3 weeks kept their positions. were generously rewarded. Those who had wavered were given one single chance to prove loyalty by returning everything they'd taken while Marcus was in the hospital. As for the 3 who had switched sides to Caruso, they received a call from Dante, and after that call, no one ever saw them appear at any negotiating table in the city again. Marcus reclaimed each territory methodically and with far greater force than before he was shot. Because, before the shooting, he had been ruthless simply because it was the only way he knew, but now he was ruthless because he had something to protect. Yet, between closed-door meetings where he decided other people's fates with a single nod, between midnight calls where his voice stayed cold as ice, between moments when Marcus Stone was exactly the monster the underworld feared, he found himself thinking about Kara's voice, not on purpose. Her voice just surfaced in the middle of revenue reports or strategy meetings. Her voice talking about Lily pointing at the moon, about the one-eyed stuffed bunny, about the way she'd said, "I think maybe you needed to hear a voice that didn't ask anything from you." And every time that voice cut in, Marcus needed a few seconds to pull himself back into the room full of men waiting for his command. In the second week after his discharge, Marcus called the hospital to schedule a follow-up appointment. Dante looked at him with quiet confusion, but said nothing, because Marcus had private doctors who could come to the penthouse any time. And both of them knew it. Marcus went to the hospital in the afternoon, met with Dr. Park for 30 minutes. Listened as she said his recovery was continuing in ways she couldn't explain. Then left the clinic and slowed his steps as he passed the basement area where the cleaning staff was starting the evening shift. He saw Kara pushing her cart into the elevator, hair in a ponytail, light blue uniform, worn sneakers. And when she looked up and saw him standing at the end of the hallway, she stopped, one hand still on the cart handle. Unsure whether to say hello or turn away, Marcus walked over, Dante 3 steps behind, and said he wanted to speak with her. They sat in the hospital cafe on the ground floor, Marcus drinking black coffee, Kara ordering nothing because she didn't want him to pay for her. Not even a cup of coffee. Marcus spoke directly, no detours, because he didn't know how to do detours. He said he was starting a real charity organization, not a front, a real one, focused on providing child care support for night shift hospital workers and emergency help for single mother families. And he wanted Kara to run it, triple her current salary, full medical insurance for her and Lily, and a 2-bedroom apartment in a safe area near good schools. Not a gift, benefits attached to the position of executive director. Kara listened, stayed silent for a long time, looking down at the table, and Marcus waited, which was unusual for him, but he waited for her. Then Kara looked up, met his gray eyes she now knew could be ice, cold to the world, but had gone soft once in a hospital room in front of her, and she said no. She thanked him, but said no. She didn't accept charity. She had lived 27 years on her own labor and would keep doing so. She didn't want to owe anyone anything because she already owed too much in her life, and she said if he truly wanted to help, he should help people who needed it more. Because at least she was still standing on her own 2 feet, Marcus looked at her after the refusal. And he wasn't angry. This nearly made Dante at the neighboring table drop his coffee, because in 20 years, anyone who had refused Marcus Stone had faced consequences. Not always violent, but never pleasant, and now a janitor had just said no to his boss, and his boss was looking at her with what Dante could only describe as irrespect. Marcus nodded, said he understood, then stood up, and before leaving he turned back and said the offer would stay open whenever she changed her mind. Then walked out of the hospital cafe with Dante following, and in the car on the way back to the penthouse, Dante glanced at his boss in the rear-view mirror and saw Marcus Stone looking out the window with the corner of his mouth slightly curved, not a smile, but almost one, and Dante thought this was the first time in his life he had seen his boss be refused without wanting to destroy the person who refused him. And maybe that was a sign of something Dante had no word for other than change. The truth came looking for Kara on a Thursday evening. 2 weeks after the meeting in the hospital cafe, she was sitting in the basement staff break room, eating half a sandwich from home, waiting for her evening shift to start. The old television mounted on the wall was always tuned to local news. Nobody really watched it, but that night Kara looked up because she heard a familiar name. On the screen was a breaking news segment. Reporter standing outside a federal building, ticker running below. Marcus Stone, the notorious East Coast mob boss, had miraculously survived after 3 weeks in a coma. And the FBI was increasing surveillance of the Stone family. Then his image appeared, not a hospital photo. An older one, Marcus in a black suit, stepping out of a courthouse, cold gray eyes staring straight into the camera. Face completely empty, Dante holding an umbrella behind him while the reporter talked about the Stone criminal empire, about fraud and money laundering allegations, about the assassination attempt outside a downtown restaurant, about how his mysterious waking had shocked both law enforcement and the underworld, the half sandwich slipped from Kara's hand. She didn't pick it up. She sat there staring at the screen without blinking as the reporter continued listing what Marcus Stone was accused of having done. The people hurt, the businesses squeezed, the neighborhoods living in fear under his family's control. And each word landed like a punch to Kara's chest because she realized the man she'd spoken to every night, the man she'd prayed for, the man she'd cried over when she thought he was dying, the man her daughter had slept on, wasn't some unlucky anonymous patient, but one of the most dangerous men in the city. Shock came first, an icy wave from the top of her head to her feet, the kind of cold that made Kara grip the edge of the chair so she wouldn't fall. Then fear followed. Fear for herself, fear for Lily, because she had carried her daughter into the hospital room of a mob boss, let her child sleep on the chest of a man guarded by armed security, while she'd assumed it was just because he was wealthy. Then anger arrived, hot and sharp, replacing fear, because Kara felt deceived, felt her kindness had been used even if she didn't yet understand how, felt she'd opened herself and poured out her deepest secrets and pain to someone she hadn't known at all, and that he'd sat across from her drinking coffee without saying a word about the truth. Kara didn't wait. She found out Marcus had already been discharged, then did something she'd never imagined she would do. She used the phone number Marcus had left when he offered her the job and called. Dante answered, and Kara said in a voice shaking with anger rather than fear, she needed to see Marcus Stone right now. 2 hours later, they were sitting across from each other in the hospital cafe, same table as before. But this time, Kara wasn't polite, and she wasn't gentle. She looked straight into his eyes and said she'd seen the news. She knew who he was now. She'd been stupid to tell a mob boss about her daughter, about where she lived, about her fears. She didn't want any connection to his world, not even a single thread, that her daughter was everything she had, and she wouldn't let Lily be put in danger for anyone. And she told him to forget her, forget Lily, forget the voice from those nights, because Kara Flynn didn't belong in Marcus Stone's world. Marcus listened without interrupting, without frowning, without going cold, and when Kara finished, the cafe sat in heavy silence between them for a long moment. Then Marcus spoke, and it wasn't the voice of a boss giving orders. It was a voice Kara had never heard before, a voice fractured at the edges of every word, the voice of a man saying something he'd never said to anyone and likely never would again. He told her she was the only person who had spoken to him while he lay there, not because of who he was, because she hadn't known who he was. That she spoke to him because of who she was, because she believed the soul could hear what the body couldn't, because she told moon stories to a dying stranger, because where the rest of the world saw only power or a threat, she saw a lonely man who had never truly lived. That in 36 years no one had ever looked at him that way, not a single person, that she was the only one, and that he was asking her not to take that away. Marcus said nothing more. He placed money for the coffee on the table, even though neither of them had drunk anything, then stood and left with Dante following, and Kara stayed behind, alone in the hospital cafe, staring at the empty chair across from her. She left 10 minutes later, went to clean rooms on the evening shift like every other day, and she didn't call Marcus that night, or the next day, or the day after that, but his words wouldn't leave her. They followed her onto the bus back to the Bronx, followed her into the studio apartment, followed her into bed where she lay beside Lily, sleeping with the one-eyed stuffed bunny in her arms. You are the only one. Kara closed her eyes, and she saw those gray eyes, not the cold eyes from the television, but the broken eyes from the cafe, the eyes of a 14-year-old orphan still hiding inside a 36-year-old crime boss, and she understood she was angry at him for hiding the truth. But she couldn't hate him for the pain, because Kara Flynn knew what loneliness looked like, and it didn't change whether you lived in a Bronx studio or a penthouse uptown. Victor Caruso didn't become the most powerful man in the South by overlooking details. From the moment Marcus woke up, Caruso had men tracking his every move. And it didn't take long for an unusual report to surface. Marcus Stone, a man who never saw the same woman twice, had met a hospital janitor twice in 2 weeks, both times without his full security detail, only Dante at his side, as if he didn't want to frighten her. Caruso dug deeper, and within days he had a name, an address, a work schedule, and grainy photos of Kara pushing Lily's stroller down the street. And he smiled, because in 30 years of this life, he had learned that no matter how powerful a man was, he always had a weakness. And Marcus Stone's weakness wasn't an empire or territory or money. It was a thin janitor and her small daughter. Kara sensed something was wrong on the 3rd night. A black car parked across the street from her building, headlights still on, appeared at 10 at night when she came home from her shift, and was still there at 4 in the morning when she woke to feed Lily. The first night, she told herself it was a neighbor's guest. The 2nd night, unease crept in. The 3rd night, she stood behind the curtain and saw the red glow of a cigarette inside the car, and knew someone was sitting there watching her window. She closed the curtain, locked the door twice, slid the safety bolt, then sat on the bed holding Lily, and didn't sleep until dawn. She wanted to believe she was being paranoid, that this was just New York. Cars park overnight all the time, but her gut knew this wasn't normal. The same gut that had warned her about Ryan before her mind caught up, and she hadn't listened then. So this time she listened. Then came the 7th night. Kara came home close to midnight, carrying Lily asleep from Mrs. Kim's place, opened the apartment door, turned on the light, and knew immediately someone had been inside. Not because anything was disturbed, not because a lock was broken. Everything looked completely normal. But there was a faint smell, unfamiliar men's cologne, in a room that only ever smelled of baby milk and cleaning soap. and she knew it wasn't hers, wasn't Mrs. Kim's, wasn't anyone who had ever belonged in that apartment. Then she saw it, on Lily's pillow where her daughter slept every night beside the one-eyed stuffed bunny lay a single red rose. Placed perfectly in the center, petals fresh, stem neatly cut, like it came from an expensive florist. No card, no note, none was needed, because the message was clearer than any threat. We know where your daughter sleeps. We can come in whenever we want, and next time it might not be a flower. Kara looked at the rose, and her body reacted before her mind could. Her knees buckled, her arms clutched Lily so tightly the child woke and began to cry. And Kara ran into the bathroom, the only room with a lock, shut the door, and slid to the cold tile floor with her back against the tub, and held Lily while they both cried. She sat there for an hour, shaking uncontrollably, until Lily finally cried herself back to sleep against her chest. And in the darkness, Kara thought through every option she had. Call the police and say what? Someone left a flower on my child's pillow. They'd laugh at her, move away, but where and with what money? Run, but run to where, when she had no family? No friends, no one in the world except the child sleeping against her. Then she thought of Marcus. She thought of what he'd said in the cafe. She thought of those fractured eyes, and she hated herself for what she was about to do, but she did it. Because she was a mother, and mothers do whatever they must. Kara pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the only number she had. Dante answered on the first ring, like always, and Kara said in a voice she tried to steady and failed, "Someone's been in my apartment. Someone left a flower on my child's pillow. I need help." Dante didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." 15 minutes, exactly 15 minutes later, there was a knock, and Dante's voice said, "It's me." Kara opened the door. Dante stood there with 2 other men. One immediately swept the apartment. The other stood guard in the hallway. And Dante looked at the rose on the pillow, looked at Kara's face, then said, "Leave now. Take what the child needs. Don't bring anything else." 20 minutes later, Kara sat in the back seat of a black SUV, holding Lily wrapped in a blanket. Watching the city slide past the window in the night, she didn't know where they were going, until the car stopped in front of a high-rise on the Upper East Side, and Dante led her into a private elevator straight to the top floor. The elevator doors opened onto the penthouse, and Marcus stood there. No suit, no polished look, just a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark pants. Hair uncombed, eyes showing he hadn't slept either, though it was nearly 2 in the morning. He looked at Kara stepping out with Lily in her arms. Face drained of color, eyes swollen red, hands still shaking, and the child curled against her chest, clutching the one-eyed bunny in restless sleep. And something on Marcus's face broke, not softened like in the hospital room, not fractured like in the cafe. Shattered completely, like a wall he'd built over 22 years since his father died, collapsing in a single instant. At the sight of a woman trembling with her child because his world had touched her life, Marcus stepped forward. Didn't touch Kara because he knew she wasn't ready for that, but stood close enough for her to know he was there. And he said to Dante, in a voice that wasn't loud, but carried the weight of stone in every word, "Find Caruso." And this, Dante nodded once and stepped back into the elevator. And in the weeks that followed, Victor Caruso's network was taken apart piece by piece, in ways only the underworld ever learned the details of. No one spoke of what finally happened to Caruso. No one asked, and when his name stopped appearing in any conversation in any bar or nightclub in the city, everyone understood. Marcus Stone had proven once again why he was the boss, and that anyone who touched what he protected would pay, not with territory or money, but with everything. A week after Caruso vanished from the underworld map, Trevor Stone came to Marcus's penthouse on a Sunday afternoon. Not to discuss strategy, not to sign papers, because Marcus had called and said his brother should come for dinner. Just that, and Trevor came because it was the first time in more than 10 years Marcus had invited him without an agenda. They sat in the wide living room overlooking Central Park, 2 glasses of whiskey on the table, and for the first time in a very long while, the 2 brothers talked like brothers, instead of 2 pillars of an empire trying not to collapse. Trevor said the night before the 72 hours ended, after he signed the papers to remove the ventilator and finished the meeting with the crime bosses, he drove home, parked in the garage, shut off the engine, and sat in the dark for 3 hours. He said he cried for the first time since their father's funeral 22 years earlier, not because he feared losing the empire, but because he realized he was about to let his brother die without the 2 of them ever saying a single truly important thing to each other beyond numbers and strategy. Marcus listened and didn't know how to respond because the Stone family hadn't taught its sons how to answer honesty. But he put a hand on Trevor's shoulder and held it there, and Trevor put his hand over his brother's. And then the 2 men who had been hard their whole lives hugged for the first time since standing beside their father's coffin. A brief and awkward embrace, in the way of men who weren't used to holding anyone, but real, more real than any handshake or nod they'd shared in 20 years. Trevor left at 9 in the evening. When the elevator doors closed, the penthouse returned to 3 people: Marcus, Kara, and Lily. Kara and Lily had been there for more than a week, since the night of the flower on the pillow. Marcus had given them a private guest suite with a locking door, so Kara would feel safe, and he kept a respectful distance, never entering when the door was closed, never touching Kara or Lily unless invited, but Lily didn't understand distance. She was almost 2, and the penthouse was the most magical place her small feet had ever explored. She ran everywhere, touching everything, with the fearless curiosity of a child who didn't yet know the world could hurt her. And that evening, while Kara washed dishes in the kitchen, Lily found Marcus. He was sitting alone on the terrace overlooking the city, second glass of whiskey in hand, Manhattan lights reflected in his gray eyes, thinking about his talk with Trevor, about wasted years, about words never spoken, when he heard tiny footsteps padding across the floor. Lily stood in the doorway, looking at him with wide eyes, the one-eyed stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. She wasn't shy, she wasn't afraid, she just walked straight to Marcus and climbed into his lap, with the natural ease of a child who believes every pair of arms is a safe place. Marcus froze. He set the whiskey down too fast, didn't know what to do with his arms. Hands that had held guns, struck blows, signed orders of destruction, now being grabbed by a child not yet 2 years old. Tugging at his index finger, Lily held his hand, pulled it toward the sky, pointed up, and said in a small, clear, proud voice, "Moon." The moon hung over the city, not full, just a thin crescent, but Lily looked at it like it was the most beautiful thing in the universe. Then turned back to Marcus, waiting for him to say yes, that's the moon, because that was how she shared joy with the adults in her life. Marcus looked down at the tiny face lifted toward him and didn't know what to do with this gentleness, didn't know where to place it in a life built of violence and shadow, but he heard himself say softly, "Moon," and Lily laughed, the way children laugh when an adult truly understands them. Then she rested her head against his chest and sat quietly watching the moon, holding his finger and not letting go. Kara stood in the darkness behind the glass door, hands still wet with dishwater, and she saw everything. She saw the most powerful mob boss on the East Coast sitting perfectly still on the terrace for fear that a sudden movement might startle the child on his lap. She saw hands that had done terrible things cradling her daughter's tiny fingers. And she saw the real person behind Marcus Stone, the 14-year-old orphan who had never been held and had become dangerous to survive, now being taught by a stranger's child how to touch the world without destroying it. In the days that followed, warmth grew among the three of them slowly. The way the moon changes shape each night. Marcus cooked pasta for Lily at 2 in the morning when she woke hungry. Standing in his $1 million kitchen, boiling noodles in a pot he had to look up how to use because he'd never cooked anything in his life. He read to Lily every night at bedtime, his voice stiff and awkward because he wasn't used to reading out loud. But Lily didn't care if the voice was good or bad. She just needed someone there, and he read until she fell asleep. Then kept reading a few more pages because he didn't want to stop. Some nights, Kara and Marcus sat in the kitchen drinking coffee after Lily was asleep, their hands accidentally brushing when they both reached for the pot at the same time, both pulling back at once, pretending nothing happened, though both knew something had, and neither was ready to name it. Then one night, Lily said his name in her sleep. She lay in her little bed, hugging the one-eyed bunny, eyes closed, and the word Marcus slipped from her small lips in a dreamy whisper. Natural and easy, like the name belonged in her safe vocabulary alongside Mama and Moon. Marcus was standing in the doorway, checking on her before bed. A habit he couldn't remember starting, and he heard his name from the mouth of a sleeping child and stood there a long time without moving. Then tears ran down his face, not many, just 2, one on each cheek, but they were the first tears Marcus Stone had shed since the day his father died. And he let them fall because he thought no one was watching, but Kara saw. She stood in the hallway behind him and saw the tears on the cheeks of the man the underworld feared. And she said nothing, didn't wipe them away, didn't touch him. She simply stepped forward and sat beside him on the floor outside Lily's room, her shoulder against his. And she sat there in silence, and Marcus sat there in silence, and together they watched the child sleep through the cracked door. And no one spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying, and that was enough. In the months that followed, Marcus Stone did something no one in the underworld thought he ever would. He began to walk away from it, not all at once, not naively, because Marcus understood an empire built on blood couldn't be changed overnight. But he started moving each part of the business towards something real and legal. Real estate that truly was real estate, not money laundering through property. Restaurants that made honest money, not fronts. Investments in technology and healthcare instead of dark corridors. Trevor was the first to notice the shift, and for the first time in his life, he looked at his younger brother, not with worry, but with hope, then rolled up his sleeves and did what he did best, turning vision into numbers. What surprised Dante and Trevor and everyone around Marcus, even more than the move toward legitimacy, was the charity. Marcus founded it with his own clean money, not shadow funds, named it the Moon Foundation, and defined its mission with the same clarity he used when giving orders to build free child care systems inside hospitals for night shift workers, so no mother would ever have to bring a sick child to work because there was no one to watch them, to provide emergency support for single mother families on the edge. and to run programs to help women like Kara find a way out of dangerous situations before it was too late. When Marcus offered Kara the role of executive director, for the second time she didn't refuse, not because her circumstances had changed, or because she'd softened toward money, but because this time she understood it wasn't charity, it was a mission she believed in. A mission written in her own life, in nights carrying a sick child to work because there was no one to help, in moments backed into corners with no rescue. And she told Marcus she accepted, because she wanted to make sure no mother ever had to live what she had lived. And Marcus nodded, because he didn't need any other reason. 6 months after Marcus Stone opened his eyes in that hospital bed, he stood in the new office of the Moon Foundation, a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn, chosen because it sat in the heart of the community the foundation served, rather than inside a glass tower in Manhattan, far from reality. The warehouse walls were covered with children's drawings from the neighborhood, photographs of families the foundation had helped. And at the center of the largest wall was a mural Kara had finished with the neighborhood children over the past month. A star-filled night sky with a large golden moon at the center, surrounded by hundreds of small colorful handprints from children who had pressed their hands to the wall and left their mark on the world. Lily ran through the office, a tiny feet pattering across the floor, the one-eyed stuffed bunny tucked under her arm as always. And she ran straight to Marcus, grabbed his hand, and pulled him along, because she had something important to show. Marcus let her lead, his long strides slowing down to match her small steps, and Lily stopped in front of the mural, pointed to a small blue handprint just to the left of the moon, and said in the most serious voice a nearly 2-year-old could manage, "That's Lily's." Marcus knelt to her eye level, looked at the tiny handprint on the wall, then at Lily, and said, "It's beautiful." Just like you. Kara stood on the other side of the room watching them, her heart so full she had to breathe deeply. In 6 months, they had hired a 12-person team, built child care systems in 5 hospitals, provided emergency support to more than 300 families. And they were only getting started, but more than the numbers, they had become a family, not a traditional one. Not one anyone would have predicted, but a real one, built from late-night pasta cooking, bedtime stories. Shoulders touching in silence outside a sleeping child's room, Marcus looked up at Kara across the room. And between them was the invisible thread her grandmother had taught her about when she was little, the thread she now knew was real. Then Marcus called out, "Come here. Lily says we all have to put our handprints on the wall." The 3 of them stood before the mural. Kara opened the paint box, and one by one they dipped their hands into the paint and pressed them onto the wall beside the golden moon. Lily's tiny blue handprint was already there, Kara's handprint, slender fingers pressed in silver. Marcus's handprint, the largest, pressed in dark gray. The same hand still marked with calluses from years of holding weapons, now smeared with paint, and the laughter of a nearly 2-year-old clapping when she saw the grown-ups follow her lead. 3 handprints of different sizes, side by side, overlapping slightly at the edges, forming their own small constellation on the wall among hundreds of others, but these 3 belonged together in a way that didn't need explaining. Lily looked up at the mural, saw the large golden moon in the painted night sky, and pointed up, saying "Moon" in the same voice that 6 months earlier had reached a man lost in a coma and kept him from drifting away. Marcus and Kara answered "Moon" together, then looked at each other and smiled. A soft smile, shared by 2 people who had walked through too much darkness, not to treasure every tiny piece of light. And they stood there beneath a painted sky full of stars and dreams, 3 souls who had found each other in the dark and pulled one another into the light, hand in hand, ready to spend the rest of their lives helping others find their own constellation in the night, because sometimes the most miraculous magic doesn't come from medicine or money or power. It comes from the simplest and most powerful act of all, treating each other with kindness. We are all connected by invisible threads. And when you gently pull on one somewhere, someone will feel it, and if you're lucky, they'll pull back,